All right, good morning. It's good seeing all your faces this morning. I'm Maham Akbar. I'm a public policy director at Truth Initiative. And I'm here today to give a part two to last year's presentation, in case you were here for it, by my colleague at Truth, Elizabeth Doe. She discussed the industry's targeted marketing practices and the health impacts on groups that have been economically and socially marginalized. I'm going to focus on the policies that can be implemented at the national level to address those health disparities in tobacco prevention and control. If you aren't familiar with Truth Initiative, we're America's largest nonprofit public health organization dedicated to making tobacco use and nicotine addiction a thing of the past. We believe that each individual has the right to live in a world free from tobacco and nicotine dependence, tobacco-related death and disease, and the devastating dollar cost to individuals and society. So Truth Initiative was actually created out of the largest civil litigation settlement in U.S. history in 1998 between the major tobacco companies, 46 U.S. states, D.C., and 5 U.S. territories at that time. Through that agreement, which is referred to as the Master Settlement Agreement, it also called for the creation of an independent organization that was dedicated to youth tobacco use and prevention. So that organization is what is now Truth Initiative. So in line with our mission to create a culture where young people reject smoking, vaping, and nicotine, I'm here today to talk about the policies at the national level that can counter the impact big tobacco has on groups that have been economically and marginally and socially marginalized. So per this Master Settlement Agreement, tobacco, I do have to say upfront that one of the provisions is that we cannot lobby. So that means we can't take positions on specific pieces of legislation. But lobbying is just one activity under the umbrella of advocacy. Our lobbying restriction in no way prohibits us from working in the regulatory space. And so we do work a lot with FDA on implementing something called the Tobacco Control Act, which was passed by Congress in 2009. And the heart of our advocacy efforts lie in ensuring that FDA implements the Tobacco Control Act in the way that Congress had intended for it to be implemented. I want to start by laying a bit of the groundwork of where we are with youth tobacco use today nationally and here in South Carolina specifically. The most recent data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey shows that 16.5% of high school students and 4.5% of middle school students are currently using any tobacco product, which means at least once in the past 30 days. So that represents more than 3 million middle and high school students who are currently using any tobacco product. And then diving deeper into that national data, so about 1 in 6 high school students is using any tobacco product. E-cigarettes are the most commonly reported tobacco product that they're using. But I do find it really interesting that cigars are the most common combustible tobacco product that are smoked among youth. And then here are some quick statistics on tobacco use here in South Carolina. Although rates of cigarette use among high school students is a bit lower than the national average, in the YRBS anyway, rates among adults is slightly higher. So further, tobacco product use in the state is not limited to just cigarettes. Use of smokeless tobacco and e-cigarettes are also common. Especially concerning is the high rate of e-cigarette use among youth. And then we can explore prevalence a little bit deeper. Among youth here in South Carolina, there are differences across race and ethnicity. A larger proportion of white and youth reporting to be of multiple races are smoking cigarettes relative to Black, Hispanic, and Asian high school students. E-cigarette use is quite high among all races and ethnicities, except Hispanic youth, and are highest among white and high school students reporting to be of multiple races. What's also a little surprising here is that Black high school students are using smokeless tobacco at a higher rate than their peers of other races and ethnicities. So annually, the industry spends more than $9 billion on the marketing tobacco products. And of that, an estimated almost 200 million is spent here in South Carolina. We know that those who use tobacco through their lifespan are at higher risk of negative health effects. Tobacco contains more than 70 carcinogens and can harm nearly every organ of the body. Added on this, and on average, people who smoke die about 10 years earlier than never smokers. We also see that they're at heightened risk for at least 14 types of cancer, heart disease, stroke, lung disease, diabetes, COPD, and weakened immune systems. And then you can just imagine what impact this has on the nation, especially as tobacco remains the leading cause of preventable death and disease in the U.S. We know tobacco use is not an equal opportunity killer. Smoking disproportionately affects the poor, homeless people, racial minorities, LGBT persons, and those suffering from mental illness and substance abuse disorders. And these are the tobacco-related expenditures related to smoking here in South Carolina. The state and federal tax burden from smoking-caused expenditures is about $968 per household, and smoking-caused losses in productivity are about $5.7 billion. Now, since last year's summit, there is new leadership at FDA, FDA Center for Tobacco Products, more specifically, and that's really exciting for a number of reasons. Dr. Brian King was appointed to the head of CTP in July of last year. And one of his key priorities is bringing health equity to the forefront of tobacco product regulation. And so he has highlighted specific ways that FDA is working to address health equity, which includes advancing tobacco product regulations, developing evidence-based public education campaigns, gathering the best science, and then building and sustaining relationships with stakeholders. And so when we dig a little deeper into some of those tobacco product regulations that FDA is working on, that'll improve health equity. One thing is that the Tobacco Control Act, some of you may know, it did ban flavored cigarettes. So these types of cigarettes are not on the market anymore. But as most of us know, menthol cigarettes were excluded from that ban, and so these are on the market. They also, the ban only applied to cigarettes. So flavored cigars, hookah, and e-cigarettes are still allowed. These products come in an array of candy, fruit, and dessert and cocktail flavors. They typically come in bright, colorful packaging and often are sold individually and cheaply, which make them really appealing to youth and young adults. We know flavors are a major reason that youth and young adults try and use tobacco products. Youth and young adults use the flavored products more than any other age group. They're often the first tobacco product that youth and young adults will ever use, and they perceive them to be more appealing, better tasting, and less harmful than non-flavored products. FDA does recognize this, so there are some policies they're working on to address flavored products. So like I mentioned, the Tobacco Control Act exempted menthol when it banned flavored cigarettes, and it didn't apply to cigars at all. Instead, Congress wanted something called the Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee, which was established by the new law to make a recommendation about menthol to FDA and based on the available scientific evidence. And so they finally did do that in 2011 when they concluded that the removal of menthol cigarettes from the marketplace would benefit public health in the US. So then fast forward to more than 10 years later to 2022. By the way, I am quickly skipping over the details of a something called a citizen petition that was filed with our national partners, Public Health Law Center leading the way on that. FDA twice issuing something called an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, a lawsuit from the industry challenging the composition of the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee and the menthol report that they had issued, which they did eventually lose. Another lawsuit from public health groups, and then finally the proposed rule was put out by FDA last year. in April, and the proposed rules, there were two proposed rules. One was to prohibit menthol cigarettes, and one was to prohibit all characterizing flavors in cigars. Menthol cigarettes increase initiation among youth. They increase dependence among both youth and adult smokers and make it harder to smoke. An overwhelming amount of evidence supports finalizing the proposed rules for several reasons. We know that menthol cigarettes are starter products that help young people initiate cigarette use and progress to regular smoking. They increase dependence on nicotine and tobacco. They make it harder to quit smoking, especially among Black Americans who smoke. And they've been insidiously marketed to many vulnerable groups, including to Black American communities, LGBTQ plus communities, which now bear a disproportionate burden from menthol cigarettes. And they're also used at a high rate by those with mental illness. Menthol cigarettes have had a huge impact on public health. One study found that between 1980 and 2018, there were 10.1 million extra smokers attributed to menthol cigarettes, along with 378,000 premature deaths. Removing menthol cigarettes from the market is a social justice issue that can help reduce health disparities among many minority groups, and particularly among Black Americans. As you can see in this image, well, it might be a little bit hard to tell, but in the image on the right, menthol cigarettes are used by African American and other minority groups at higher levels than their white counterparts. The high use of menthols among minorities, particularly among African Americans, contribute to tobacco-related health disparities among these groups. In addition to these stark numbers, another study found that from 2011 to 2018, while menthol use among youth overall declined, there was no decline in menthol use among Black and Hispanic students. So we know that from other communities that have removed menthol cigarettes from their markets, we've seen reduced youth use of tobacco products. We've seen increased attempts in successfully quitting among adults who smoke, and we've seen decreased sales of not only the restricted products, but also overall sales of tobacco products. Flavored cigars have also had a huge impact on public health. Cigars are the most commonly used combustible tobacco product among youth, and flavors in cigars increase the appeal of these products and make them easier to use, particularly among youth and young adults. Tobacco companies have targeted the Black community with flavored cigars, resulting in higher rates of cigar smoking among Black youth. Cigars are the most commonly used product among all high school students, and they come in hundreds of flavors. As you can see here, Black youth are more likely to be current cigar users than any other race and ethnicity group. So the proposed rules to remove menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars would greatly benefit public health. Menthol cigarettes make up a large portion of the market here in the U.S. Taking those off of the market would decrease the appeal of the cigarettes and ease of smoking, thus minimizing the likelihood of smoking initiation and subsequent nicotine dependence. It could also improve the health of current smokers by decreasing cigarette consumption and encouraging those who do smoke to quit. There would also be it would also help minimize death and disease associated with secondhand smoke exposure. Now, the FDA has estimated that prohibiting menthol in cigarettes would prevent 654,000 premature deaths in 40 years. Of that, an estimated 238,000 premature African American deaths would be prevented in 40 years. The FDA also concluded that removing flavored cigars from the market would protect public health by decreasing the appeal of cigars and many of the same benefits that we would see from menthol cigarettes. Removing them would prevent youth from taking it up, becoming regular cigar smokers, also help those who are current, adults who are current cigar smokers to reduce their consumption and hopefully quit. Now, the proposed rules are just the first step. The comment period ended last August, and FDA received nearly 250,000 comments on those two proposed rules. They now have to finalize those proposed rules, which they have said they'll do probably this fall or toward the end of the year. But sadly, it's going to take years and years for these rules to go into effect because the industry is just going to sue to delay as much as they can. Now, the tobacco industry is already pushing against these proposed rules. They say that a ban on menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars will increase overcriminalization and mass incarceration of Black Americans. These are just blatant attempts to exploit a real social justice issue in our country for commercial gain. Excessive force and systematic racism are problems that must be addressed independently of public health measures. So these proposed rules are not a prohibition on purchasing, using, or possessing menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. And FDA has said rather they would restrict the enforcement would fall on manufacturers and retailers. And so it's easy to see why the industry is trying to protect its menthol cigarettes.
What's worth more to big tobacco? 320,000 human lives or $33 billion? Sadly, we know the answer. That's why they've been fighting to protect menthols for over a decade. Doubt they'd want to lose the 64% of young adult smokers who said they'd quit smoking without menthols. And the billions in annual revenue that comes from menthols. Hundreds of thousands of lives could be lost by 2050 if menthols stay on the market.
And so FDA really does need to just issue these final proposed rules despite, issue the final rules despite any aggressive tobacco industry interference. So Truth Initiative fully supports the proposed rules, but we do recommend a few things to make sure these are strong policies. First, FDA must protect against any tobacco industry attempts to exploit any loopholes and make sure that the final rules are strong. So they have to have both the menthol cigarette and the flavored cigar product standards have to be finalized and implemented as quickly as the law will allow. Delaying is a favorite tactic of the industry and it cannot be allowed. FDA must find a balance for what it means by characterizing flavor so that it's specific enough to capture flavor products that have caused so much public health harm, but not so specific that it can be easily circumvented. The rule has to apply to all components and accessories of cigarettes and cigars. It should not exempt any cigarettes or cigar products from these standards, and they must issue the rules simultaneous to avoid product substitution. And then they should also ensure that the rules are enforced to get the full benefits of the public health that these rules can achieve. Now, there are, the industry's already working to circumvent menthol restrictions here in the US. Currently, there's about 35% of the US population is covered by some type of flavored tobacco product sales restriction, but only 7% of the population is covered by something we call comprehensive policies, which means that it covers all flavors, all types of tobacco products. I do have to apologize, this map is a year old, so it doesn't show that California has now implemented a statewide flavor law, but it does give you an idea of where in the country the flavored product restrictions are being passed. So California passed a flavor law in August 2020, which prohibits the sale of all flavored tobacco products, except for loose leaf tobacco, hookah, and premium cigars. However, it does include menthol cigarettes, which is important. But this wasn't without a lot of drama in tobacco industry interference, but it was done and a flavor law was on the books in California. Or so you think. The tobacco industry forced a ballot measure in November of last year, which put the law on hold for nearly 2 years and required Californians to vote to uphold the bill, which they ultimately did by a decisive margin. The very next day, the industry sued, which was another delay tactic to give the companies more time to sell their products. In their lawsuit, they stated that the state was preempted by federal law and that it's FDA's primary authority to regulate tobacco products. They lost and then appealed to the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately decided not to step in. And so the law finally went into effect December 21st this past year. I do want to add that in that time that the law was on pause for nearly 2 years, tobacco companies gained an estimated $830 million in revenue from menthol cigarette sales in California alone. So you can see why they are fighting so hard against these laws. But the industry had more up its sleeve to circumvent the new law. R.J. Reynolds renamed some Camel and Newport items as newly fresh or crisp non-menthol versions in order to lure smokers with a suite of what it says are new non-menthol versions, offering a taste that satisfies the senses and a new fresh twist. These new products skirt menthol cigarette bans by simply substituting a synthetic component for menthol and are just as easy for consumers to smoke as menthol cigarettes. These menthol-like compounds activate the same receptors as menthol to produce that same sensation. It's just that menthol has a specific odor, and these synthetic cooling agents apparently don't have an odor. So if you're wondering how R.J. Reynolds could introduce new products to the market, it's because these products were authorized back in 2021 under FDA's substantial equivalence rules, meaning they found these new tobacco products mimic existing products on the market. So sales of these new non-menthol products are soaring in California. The law took effect in December, and by March of this year, sales of these new products were on pace to replace nearly half of menthol sales compared with last year. Now, the California Attorney General last month sent letters to R.J. Reynolds and ITG brands saying that these non-menthol cigarettes are packaged in the same colors and same brand names as before the law took effect, and thus are in violation of the ban. So the products are on the left are from before the law took effect, and the products on the right are the new non-menthol products. It's easy to see that they look almost exactly alike. And then just last week, R.J. Reynolds filed a lawsuit against California, stating that it stands by its new products and believes that they comply with the law and can therefore continue to be sold. So again, we see the industry continues to make flagrant moves to evade laws and regulations. So now, while it's really important for FDA to finalize the proposed rules on menthol and flavored cigars, it's even more important to make sure FDA is removing all flavored tobacco products from the market. So given the high use of e-cigarettes, especially flavored e-cigarettes by youth, we really need to see flavored e-cigarettes gone. Findings from the 2022 National Youth Tobacco Survey found that about 1 in 10 middle and high school students in the U.S. reported current use of e-cigarettes. Among these youth e-cigarette users, nearly 85% reported using flavored e-cigarettes, and more than 1 in 4 reported daily use of an e-cigarette, which is an indicator of addiction. Among current youth e-cigarette users, the most commonly used device type is something called a disposable e-cigarette. The FDA finally deemed its authority over e-cigarettes in 2016, which then required e-cigarette manufacturers to prepare something called pre-market tobacco product applications in order to stay on the market. Now, after years and years of delays and a lawsuit from public health groups over these delays, e-cigarette manufacturers had until September 9th, 2020 to submit their pre-market applications. FDA then began reviewing applications, and they received millions and millions that were submitted, and they had to determine if they're appropriate for the protection of public health and take into account the increased or decreased likelihood that existing users of tobacco products will stop or start using these products, which is a standard set by the Tobacco Control Act. So during this time of delay, the youth e-cigarette use rose to epidemic levels. The court order, which set the September 9, 2020 deadline, also granted manufacturers 1 year of grace period where their products could stay on the market while FDA conducted its review of the applications. At the 1 year point, or September 9, 2021, if products hadn't received a marketing order from FDA, they were supposed to be pulled off the market. Additionally, no new markets were supposed to be allowed on the market no new products were supposed to be allowed to enter the market without this pre-authorization. Now, FDA has said it won't finish its review of pre-market applications until the end of this year, which is more than 2 years after the September 9th, 2021 court order deadline to remove products that haven't received FDA permission to stay on the market. FDA's inaction does have a high cost. We found that in the year since the FDA missed the court order deadline to approve or reject e-cigarette applications, nearly 2.5 million youth and young adults started using vaping products for the first time. Now, flavors do play a role in how products impact public health and are something FDA has to take into account as they evaluate products. And with the PMTA actions thus far, they do seem to be considering at least some flavors. So to date, only 23 e-cigarette products have been granted marketing authorization by the FDA. FDA has issued some major denials, including for Juul and some menthol e-cigarettes, which is a big deal. But however, the industry has sued, appealing those denial orders, and so all of these products have not yet been taken off the market. While FDA says it's completed review and taken action on over 99% of the applications for over 26 million new tobacco products that they received, which sounds great. Unfortunately, these products represent just a small portion of the market. FDA has to continue to accelerate this progress and complete its review of all remaining e-cigarette applications, including those which have a significant market share and are more popular brands among youth. Because of the FDA's inaction, the tobacco industry continues to flood the market with new products, especially disposable e-cigarettes, which we know are really popular with young people. Now, FDA taking action on more than 99% of the pre-market applications should translate to fewer e-cigarettes. Instead, we're actually seeing a sharp increase in the number of products. A recent Truth Initiative review of U.S. retail sales data found that the number of unique e-cigarette products more than quadrupled in just 1 year, from 453 in June 2021 to over 2,000 in June 2022. So this shows how e-cigarette companies are continuing to flout the regulatory process and launch new products without authorization from FDA. Now, FDA has taken some enforcement action against companies acting in some egregious ways. Last summer, they issued a warning letter to a company for marketing illegal flavored nicotine gummies. These came in blue raz, cherry bomb, and pineapple flavors. And these types of gummies are of particular public health concern, which FDA recognized when it said that they bear resemblance to kid-friendly food or candy products and have the potential to cause severe nicotine toxicity or even death among young children. The packaging claims that the products contain tobacco-free nicotine, and the company did not submit a pre-market tobacco product application or have marketing authorization from FDA to sell these products. In its announcement, FDA also cited a study that had found that flavored non-tobacco oral nicotine products such as these were the most commonly used tobacco product among youth in Southern California after e-cigarettes. Other enforcement actions include warning letters to e-cigarettes for selling products that look like toys and youth appealing electronics like Nintendo Game Boy, glow sticks, that feature youth appealing characters from TV shows and video game characters. So you've got The Simpsons, Rick and Morty, Minions on here. And then those that imitate food products like popsicles. But these enforcement actions by FDA are just not enough. And again, tobacco product manufacturers are playing a game of catch me if you can with the FDA. FDA's current weak enforcement processes have resulted in a de facto post-market review process rather than a pre-market review process, which is required which is what the Tobacco Control Act required. And so the industry is continuing to flood the market with new products with apparently little fear of any reprisal from the FDA. And finally, FDA has announced plans for a proposed rule to reduce the addictiveness of combustible tobacco products to non-addictive levels. This has the potential to be a significant and momentous game changer. Here's the CEOs of the biggest tobacco companies in the US at the time testifying before Congress in 1994.
Please consider yourself to be under oath.
We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive. I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
Well, we know that's a lie. The tobacco industry had known about nicotine's role in addiction for years and years. In fact, they had been manipulating their products for decades regarding the level of nicotine. There is currently no limit on nicotine levels in the U.S. for any tobacco product at the federal level, at least. Other countries, though, have placed caps on nicotine levels. The highest nicotine concentration allowed in the European Union, the UK, and Canada is 20 milligrams per milliliter, or 2%. Now, nicotine is highly addictive, and it's what keeps people coming back for more. So more recently, we have determined that nicotine stimulates the reward centers of the brain, which in the simplest terms is what get used to nicotine over time. In addition, nicotine causes very uncomfortable withdrawal symptoms. Both these factors mean that a person needs to use more and more nicotine to get the reward and to ward off the withdrawal symptoms. And while it's true that nicotine itself is not the cause of much of the health problems associated with tobacco use, it's also not harmless, especially when it comes to young people. In young people, we know that the earlier one starts using nicotine, the harder it is to quit, especially as 87% of smokers say they began smoking before the age of 18. Nicotine can harm the developing adolescent brain, and it also has an effect on concentration, learning ability, mood, and impulse control. Without the addictive levels of nicotine, current smokers would be encouraged to quit since they would remove that incentive to smoke. So this could help the nearly 70% of smokers who say they want to quit but can't because of the strong addiction. While youth and young people may still try combustible tobacco products, they're less likely to keep using it because we know that nicotine is what keeps people coming back for more to the products. A study that modeled what would happen after implementing a policy lowering nicotine levels in cigarettes and other combustible tobacco products found that if the policy had been put in place by 2020, approximately 5 million additional adult smokers would quit smoking 1 year after implementation, compared to a scenario where that policy was not enacted. The study estimates that by 2100, more than 33 million people would have avoided becoming regular smokers. This would eventually mean 8.5 million tobacco-related deaths would be prevented. Think about that. A policy that could prevent 8.5 million tobacco-related deaths. Additionally, the policy's effects would probably be even greater if considering how it has the potential to reduce secondhand smoke exposure for many Americans if all these people who quit, people who smoke quit or never become regular smokers. But while the FDA hasn't discussed nicotine levels in e-cigarettes when talking about this policy, we know that many e-cigarettes contain increasing levels of nicotine and many times match or exceed nicotine levels in cigarettes. In fact, a recent study found that the sales of e-cigarettes with the highest levels of nicotine, a 5% or greater nicotine strength, which is represented by the yellow in this graph, grew drastically in the past 5 years, increasing from 5% of total e-cigarette sales in 2017 to a whopping 81% in 2022. Another study found that between 2017 and 2022, average nicotine strength increased in e-cigarettes with flavors that were classified as menthol, fruit, candy or sweet, tobacco, and beverage flavor. Higher nicotine levels in flavored e-cigarettes is tied to greater dependence and lower motivation to quit. Without a national standard for maximum levels of nicotine in tobacco products, this ongoing trend in nicotine strengths may put young people at increasingly high risk of addiction. Now, Truth Initiative fully supports a product standard to reduce nicotine levels to non-addictive levels. When FDA first announced that it was exploring this type of product standard back in 2018, but 5 years later, this isn't even at the proposed rule status yet. So we do hope that FDA will begin that rulemaking process soon. But there are some recommendations that we have to make the policy stronger. First, FDA has to apply the policy to all combustible tobacco products and to e-cigarettes as well. This is for a number of reasons. The industry has a long history of exploiting loopholes in regulations, and any public health benefit from this product standard for lower levels of nicotine in cigarettes will be greatly reduced, if not completely erased, if other tobacco products with higher levels of nicotine remain on the market as viable substitutes. Second, the policy must be implemented all at once and not phased in. A gradual reductions will provide no public health benefit. Implementing immediately would encourage smokers to quit more quickly. Third, FDA has to educate the public about the impact reduced nicotine combustible tobacco products have on their health. So in other words, while a reduced nicotine combustible product will reduce addiction to that product, it doesn't reduce the disease risk associated with those products. And last, this is not a one and done type policy. It should instead be one part of a larger plan by FDA to regulate nicotine, including creating better tobacco cessation therapies and the other policies I discussed before, like completing pre-market review of e-cigarettes and removing all flavored products from the market. So we know that the federal regulatory process moves really slowly. But given the way prevalence rates of the industry, of the tobacco products discussed today are climbing among youth, young adults, racial and ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ persons, it's really imperative that FDA do all it can as soon as it can in order to protect public health. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions if we have any time left.